Good morning. I'm Shelley Sizemore, Director of Academic Programs and Community Engaged Research at the Pro Humanitate Institute here at Wake Forest University. Welcome to Day 2 of the Rethinking Community Conference. Allow me to introduce our MC for today, Ms. Zerlina Maxwell. She is the Director of Progressive Programming for SiriusXM and was formerly the Director of Progressive Media for Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign. Zerlina is a political analyst, speaker, and writer for a variety of national media outlets. She will help keep us on time and on task throughout the day today. Welcome, Zerlina.
Good morning. How's everybody doing today? Thank you, Shelley, and thank you to the organizers of Rethinking Community Conference. During the past decade, I have spent a great deal of time on college campuses like this one. I've been an invited speaker addressing issues of race and gender, but also, most importantly, campus sexual assault. I've traveled last year, all year, with Secretary Hillary Clinton as a part of her campaign. I went to all of the presidential debates and was a surrogate. And I've trained college students in the use of social media as a tool for organizing, including in the West Bank. I can affirm firsthand experience that the issues you have come together today to talk about are critically important and crucial. Our country and campuses are so polarized and divided right now. A lot is at stake, and we will need to rethink community if we're going to be able to find a way to move forward. So let's get started. First, a little bit of housekeeping. Today's conference is being live streamed. Welcome to everyone joining on the live stream this morning. You can follow at livestream.com/WFU/rethink. We're also partnering with the Century Foundation to live stream and archive this conference, and you can follow the Century Foundation live stream at tcf.org/content/event/rethinking-community. Any sessions not available on the live stream will be available as a permanent part of the archive on that website. We welcome comments, questions, updates, thoughts, and photos via social media, so please tweet away, Instagram, Snap. We are using a couple of different hashtags this morning. WFU Rethink, hashtag community is, and hashtag is community. I also saw this morning a lot of people are using hashtag Rethink Community, so you can use that one as well. Finally, when you arrive, you should have received a Rethinking Community Conference swag bag, which is, I think, probably part of the highlight of going to a conference. You get good swag. It contains great information for your time here, including suggestions for where to eat during your time here and during the dinner break later this evening. We encourage you to support the local businesses who partnered with this conference and who are donating a portion of their receipts to the Second Harvest Food Bank of Northwest North Carolina. Please help support their work in feeding the hungry in 18 counties right here in North Carolina. If you have any other questions while you're here, please look for one of the young people wearing a Rethinking Community t-shirt. They're volunteers here to help you this morning. And they are members of the planning team, and they're here to make sure that your experience is thoroughly thought-provoking, and anything you need, just feel free to ask them. Now let's get started with the day. First, we have a very special welcome from John B. King Jr. Mr. King is the president and CEO of the Education Trust, a national nonprofit that seeks to identify and close opportunity and achievement gaps from preschool all the way up through college. King served as the U.S. Secretary of Education under President Barack Obama, and he is an honorary Demon Deacon at this point, I think. He visited Wake Forest for a public lecture last spring and spoke to the Freedom School for 3rd to 5th graders this summer. Although unable to join us today, he wanted to affirm the importance of this gathering. So he sent a video to open our conference. Let's take a look. We're still waiting for the video. Okay. I don't know. We can watch this video later. I wasn't told to press it. I can try. Yep. But the laptop's not. That's what I'm saying. So it's not. All right. So forget the video. We're going to watch the video a little bit later when we figure out who has the video and can press play. I like that everybody's like very awake and laughing. That's really good. So now I'd like to introduce Melissa Harris Perry. She is the Maya Angelou Presidential Chair and the Faculty Director of the Pro Humanitate Institute here at Wake Forest University. Melissa.
If anybody figures out the video while I'm talking, I'm happy to be interrupted by Dr. King. Oh, well, always by Dr. King, but also by Secretary King. Thank you, Zerlina, and welcome once again to the Rethinking Community Conference. Please allow me to provide a little bit of context for this gathering, one that we have sometimes called the conference brought to you by two institutes whose names you cannot pronounce. This is Wake Forest University. Wake Forest University is both my employer but also my alma mater. So I want to tell you a little bit about this extraordinary place. We were founded in 1834, although not on this campus. This campus was built later, in the 1950s. Wake Forest was established as a manual training institute for white Southern Baptist men. They spent half their day laboring on the college's plantation. During the Civil War, Wake Forest had to close for several years because so many students were fighting for the Confederacy. Today, Wake Forest University is among the most selective undergraduate universities in the country. Manual labor has been replaced by the arts, the sciences, the humanities, and one of the country's best undergraduate business schools. Where once the school closed its doors for the Confederacy, we recently dedicated and opened the doors of the new Maya Angelou undergraduate residence hall. In these ways, Wake Forest embodies transformation. As my best friend Blair Kelly, a historian, would say, change across time. And yet the university, like the community and country in which it is situated, faces real challenges. Although this university and its medical center are the largest employers in the city, Winston-Salem and Forsyth County suffer from acute poverty and racial inequality. For example, African Americans in Forsyth County are 5 times more likely to be food insecure than white residents, and nearly 2.5 times more likely to be born with low birth weights than white residents. As compared to nearly 70% of white third graders, only 27% of black third graders in Winston-Salem schools read at grade level and perform at grade level in math. Latinos account for more than half the population growth in Winston-Salem, but Wake Forest University does not publish its crucial information in Spanish. Like many campuses and communities across the country, Wake Forest experienced a rise in Islamophobic incidents in 2016. But it was not undocumented students, nor Muslim students, who faced a vote by university faculty declaring that they were unwelcome on campus. That distinct experience of exclusion and attempted expulsion was faced by one of the co-sponsors of this conference. Last year, the Faculty Senate of Wake Forest University circulated a petition opposing the establishment of the Eudaimonia Institute. It ended in a vote of the Faculty Senate, largely symbolic, that demanded that the university return the establishing financial gift of EI, and further demanded that the university sever all ties with the Koch Foundation. The effects of this vote were quite real, denying potential course credit for students taking courses with EI faculty. At the core of those disagreements were issues more political and ideological than intellectual or scholarly. The rejection and ejection from community was enacted with as much self-righteous furor on the left as it has sometimes happened on the right. And so, in this moment, when you often hear, "This is not us," I stand here to say, this is us. This is Wake Forest. We are all of these things. We are our history, our present, and our potential future. We are the good and the bad and the ugly. We will get to some other place by facing all of what we are. The Wake Forest University motto is taken more seriously, perhaps, than any university motto. Pro humanitate. It is translated for humanity. Now, for PHI, we understand this as an ethos and an imperative for direct action public engagement, democratic engagement, social justice programming, students and faculty engaged in community learning, teaching, research. For the Eudaimonia Institute, this motto embodies the imperative of human cultivation and human flourishing through freedom and liberty. Therefore, when Provost Rogan Kersh declared that in 2016 and 2017, Wake Forest University would convene our counterparts across higher education to grapple with the effects of living in a society that is increasingly virtual, diverse, polarized, and global, EI and PHI took him seriously. And this conference is, as I mentioned yesterday, if you know anything about the Black Southern Protestant tradition, it is the response to his call. When he said, we ought to think about community, we ought to rethink it, well, Jim and I said, yeah, why not? Let's really rethink it. We are well aware that our effort to rethink community exists within specific local and national contexts. We recognize that these contexts include protesting students, boycotted and harassed speakers, debates about safe spaces versus free speech, the possible end of tenure, hikes in tuition, open carry laws, white supremacist lawlessness. The experiences are reminders that colleges and universities are not ivory towers able to avoid controversy. We are embedded in our communities. We are highly impactful actors in our economic, political, and social life, and we are the key intellectual contributors to our communities. So welcome. You are not just in a room. You are not just on live stream. You are here to rethink community, and we expect you to do so with seriousness. We expect you to do so by taking a position and holding it. We expect you to bring evidence to bear. We expect you to begin with genuine curiosity. We don't assume that the professors have all the answers. We don't assume that those holding the mic know more always than those posing the questions. We hope to foster a place for genuine rethinking. We hope to allow space for one another to think, to encourage learning, to reward questioning, to assume some measure of goodwill, while acknowledging the real-world consequences of everything that we are going to discuss. Robust disagreement, meaningful high-stakes issues. Hold them in your hand, turn them over, look on the bottom, look underneath. Everyone is welcome. No one's getting kicked out. Everyone's staying. All the speech is free. The spaces are safe for your body and your soul, but not for your brain. We plan to contest that all weekend long. So, in that spirit, welcome Donna Edwards, Senior Fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law and Wake Forest alum former Congresswoman from Maryland and a trustee of Wake Forest University. Also, Jacob T. Levy-Tomlinson, professor of political theory, professor of political science at McGill University, and a member of what we used to call Rookie Row at the University of Chicago, oh, so many years ago when we first became friends and colleagues. Dorian Warren, president of the Center for Community Change Action, vice president of the Center for Community Change, a fellow at the Roosevelt Institute, a man who just got off a red eye from California, and my friend and co-host in a new venture that we call Freedom on Tap. Okay, Chris, here we go. It's Chris Serpenant. No, I'm gonna get it right. Chris Serpenant. We've been practicing. Chris Serpenant, associate professor of philosophy at the University of New Orleans. And Michael Brennan Dotery, who is senior writer for the National Review and was recently here to speak with us about the recent events in Charlottesville. And when he was here, I made him my new conservative BFF. I told each panelist that I would give them up to 3.5 minutes to give us some prepared remarks about the two key themes around which the conference is organized. Community is how individuals and groups declare, state, show, defend, articulate, and illustrate the various ideas of what community is, and is community, how individuals and groups question, challenge, wonder, ruminate, ponder, and speculate what community is. So, Congresswoman Edwards, our trustee, I will begin with you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and good morning. You know, as I've been thinking about this, and especially, the remarks that preceded here, I thought for many of us, community changes, right? And over the course of our lifetimes, community changes. And so I just want to talk to you about what community means to me and how my communities have evolved. I grew up in a military family, and so for many years, my dad served 30 years in the Air Force, my community was that space. And what I learned in that space is that we came from all different places on installations. We had different religions. Our fathers had to serve together. We had to go to school together as young people. I thought the rest of the world was exactly like that. And then I got out in it. And so my community changed again. Here at Wake Forest University, amazing institution, I came in 1976, the year of our bicentennial. And in that community, it was a much smaller space. All of the African American students, we all ate in the same corner in the pit. Had a tough time remembering that for now. We largely socialized with ourselves. There was very little reaching out in a safe space to other communities, but then, we had to build it and build it larger. And then going into, a workplace, and community changed again, much narrower in some ways. And then I thought about Congress. Well, Congress wasn't really a community, because in communities, people support one another in healthy communities. People support one another, they validate each other, they celebrate successes, they're there for you when there are failures. Well, Congress operates opposite from that. And now I'm in a different community. I've been traveling around the country since January when I left Congress in my RV. And my community in that world has changed completely in the way that I think about it. You pull up at an RV park and you're next to a family from southwest rural Alabama, and they help you park, you help them hook up their sewer, and you begin to talk about things that you actually have in common. In fact, the RV park, I said, is very leveling. The only differences are what rig you have. And in some ways, being in that community has opened up conversations with people that I never really thought that I would have before. And it's made me think about who I view as community. And then I want to close by sharing with you a story that just happened about a week ago. I showed up in my RV in rural Ohio near Juniata College. And I went into a cafe, just randomly went into a cafe, and there was a group of women, white women, of an age. I'm of an age. And they were knitting. It was the Tuesday knitting group. And I just kind of came in. I had a documentary film crew with me. And we just asked if we could have a conversation. And it was completely random. And we talked about everything. We talked about healthcare and and education and jobs, and we talked about the president. And this was in a community that was largely of Trump voters. Most of the women who were in that room had voted for the president, and they were thinking about that in a different kind of way. And I actually built a community among that Tuesday knitting group. I got invited back, and I plan to go. And so I will just close by saying I think that, it's really important for us to look outside of our safe zones, outside of our comfort zones, to rebuild community, to look outside of ourselves. Because I think when we do that, we're going to find those commonalities, those spaces, those things that make us human beings first and political actors last. And so those are just my thoughts this morning.
Thank you. Jacob.
Is community? The answer is sometimes, indeed, I think often, no. We genuinely need community in our lives, morally and psychologically. We crave the moments of a sense of common purpose and a sense of responsibility for our fellows. Well, responsibility has a couple of meanings. It not only means responsible to help, but it means responsible and accountable, including to outsiders. And so in community, we monitor each other. We keep each other in line such that we are all more or less acting in accordance with the values, with the norms, with the project that brings us together as a community. We need that in our lives, but we need it so fundamentally that we really easily project it into sites and organizations and frameworks where it doesn't, indeed it can't belong. We have frameworks in complicated societies for disagreement, for non-community, for places where we have our separate projects and ideas to pursue, and where we do each other wrong and outsiders do us wrong if they treat us as responsible for each other in those ways. Now, I'm going to offer two examples. One is the example of a university. A university is a framework for inquiry, for finding knowledge, transmitting knowledge, preserving knowledge, but it's a framework for all of the various different ways in which people do that. And we find things going badly wrong in university lives, inside and outside, when we are called onto the mat of the external media machine. We find things going wrong when people act as if everyone in the whole institution is responsible for every line of inquiry or idea that is pursued anywhere in the institution. Insiders will take that as an excuse to try to suppress or expel because, after all, we are the kind of place that doesn't have people like that. Well, that's the language of community. That's not the language of a framework for inquiry. The outsiders, the reporters, the talk show hosts, will take the most controversial or inflammatory thing that any student or professor has said on campus and try to frighten the whole campus into this move of suppress or expel, because after all, aren't you the kind of community where you're all responsible enough for each other that you won't let each other say that and do that? no, that's not the kind of thing that we are, and that misunderstanding is a genuine poison in university life. The far more important one is a political society, which is not a community. The aspiration to make a political society, a whole nation state, over in the image of the basic human form of organization, that is, a community where we share our projects and we share that sense of watching over each other and keeping each other in line. The desire to make over a nation state in that image is what leads to the temptation of the populist and the nationalist to say, it's a problem when people who don't look like me are in charge. It's a problem when people who don't share my values are allowed to speak and have protests. It's something that I find so psychologically intolerable that this organization with which I'm supposed to deeply identify, where I'm supposed to see myself reflected, isn't that. And so in anger and fear against that non-reflection, the toxic politics of populist nationalism take hold. That say, we must retake control of this place that is our space. A part of the populace, a part of the demos, a part of the society redefines itself as being the whole and doesn't accept disagreement as legitimate. It's mentally, morally, and psychologically demanding on us to uphold frameworks for disagreement. It's hard. In an important way, it's less natural than community is. But when we don't keep track of the demands of those institutions that allow us to coexist in disagreement with different projects, each of which can be pursued legitimately, then the temptation takes hold in this poisonous way for each of us to redefine our part as being the whole and to be incapable of appropriately listening to, respecting the rights of, and coexisting in a shared space institutionally with those of our neighbors who aren't in that strong sense part of our community, but with whom we share something different and genuinely important, an institution, a framework, something that we do have a shared need to protect and uphold.
Thank you, Jacob. Dorian.
Thanks for making me follow the representative and Jacob. No pressure to you guys. Good luck. So I run an organization called the Center for Community Change. So my notion of community is pretty embedded in the name of the organization, especially the pairing of community with change. So that implies that community is never static, right? That it is always fluid, always in motion. It's actually always being rethought and reconstructed. It's always being rethought and reconstructed. Now, some of us would hope that it's being rethought and reconstructed in democratic and justice-promoting ways. But often not. And like Wake Forest, in terms of Melissa's introduction, which was very insightful, community is often about transformation. But I want to come back to this theme because I think we can't be naive about community in terms of inclusion and exclusion. And one of the elements or the pieces of this I want to argue is community is always about exclusion as much as it's about inclusion. And we're going to have to come to grips with that. A little bit about what I mean by community change. My organization was founded 50 years ago almost to be the living memorial to Robert F. Kennedy and frankly Dr. King, who both, as you know, were assassinated in 1968, and were both kind of met in the middle on a campaign around improving the lives of poor people. And the organization was born out of a movement moment, and the idea was to maintain the movement momentum from the civil rights movement in particular, and where Dr. King was headed in terms of a poor people's movement. The underlying premise of the organization is something called community organizing. Some of us think it was invented in Chicago. I'm a bit biased because I'm from Chicago. But the context is important because it was invented as a technique of empowerment of people excluded from certain communities. And in the case of Chicago, it was invented because lots of poor, mostly white immigrants were excluded from the existing political machine. So the creation of independent community organizations, geographic place-based, usually which overlapped with one's immigration and racial status, was an attempt to transform or to challenge existing exclusive community organizations called political machines. So 50 or 100 years later, we still have attempts, especially in the political space, now both virtual as well as place-based, to organize people in a sense of community with the goal of transformation. The last point I want to come back to is community is always about boundaries. It's always about boundaries. And the question I think we should be asking is, if there are always insiders and outsiders to community, how do we decide the principles of exclusion and inclusion? I would argue do no harm would be one of those principles. Are you harmed by not getting accepted into Wake Forest? Maybe your ego is for a minute, but I'm sure people find other things to do if they don't get into this fine university. So are you harmed by not being included in the community? And can we think of some principles of non-domination that within a community, among those included in a community, towards those excluded? And then who decides? This is a fundamental, there's a boundary problem and then sort of a decision rule problem. This is the essence of democracy. Who decides who's included and who's excluded? And who's harmed by that exclusion? Not all exclusion is bad or harmful or unjust. I like the communities I'm a member of. They're voluntary, most of them. Some are not. I can't really change my race. So some are, and some are voluntary, some are not. So how do we think about the boundary question and, frankly, the decision-making authority of who gets to decide who's in community and who's out, however we construct them, knowing that they're always in the process and in motion of being reconstructed and reconfigured? Thank you.
Thank you, Dora. Chris.
So I had some prepared remarks to talk about what I think is one of the most important questions related to this idea of what community is. But it turns out that a lot of those remarks were just covered in the last 2 minutes. So, thinking about who we include and who we exclude. And for me, this is perhaps one of the most important questions related to what community is. Because when we think about, say, who we want to exclude or who we want to include, there are perfectly good reasons for wanting to exclude people from certain communities. So I'm a member of a golf community. The number of us play. We compete in tournaments. We exclude people who, one, don't enjoy playing golf, but also people who are... You're killing me today, right? So exclude people who not only don't play golf, but also exclude people of, say, varying skill levels. Because if you have a tournament, you want to compete with people of similar skill levels. So there are reasonable, good reasons in many cases for wanting to exclude people from certain voluntary associations. But when we think about more important issues, say public issues, either public policy issues or issues affecting public institutions, and there I use a university broadly, even though, say, Wake Forest is a private university, but public institutions like universities, I think we need to come up with other framework or other criteria to figure out under what conditions it's reasonable to exclude people, under what conditions it's reasonable to include people. And let me suggest to you that one of the best ways of doing it is to look at the purpose or the mission of that institution. What was it established to accomplish? So just like the golf community that was set up to accomplish whatever the various sorts of things I wanted to accomplish with it, improving my golf skills, fair competition, whatever else, I think we need to look at the purpose of the institution, whether it's the state or the university, when we think about who to include or who to exclude. And this is relevant to a number of public policy issues. So when we think about issues like immigration, or we think about the criminal justice system, deciding to put someone in prison, for instance, is excluding them from our community. There may be good reasons to do so, but it's important to remember that that's what we are doing. And it affects that person not only when he or she is excluded from that community, but also when it's time, if it's time, to include that person in our community again. So what I'd like to conclude with is thinking about perhaps what the values are in some of these more public or more open communities. And one of the things that we hear about a lot, especially in institutions like Wake Forest or universities generally, is the importance of diversity and how diversity contributes positively to a community. And this is certainly the case. You know, one of the co-sponsors of this conference is the Eudaimonia Institute. And if you believe that eudaimonia, or human flourishing, is one of the goals or one of the aims of, say, the political community or the university community, then certainly valuing diversity is important. The more ideas we bring to the table, the better we are to make good decisions, not only about how to live our lives, but also about what knowledge includes. But let me also say that it's not just diversity, that you can't have diversity without the virtue of tolerance and toleration. And far too often when we hear people speak about diversity, tolerance is almost spoken of as if they're the same thing, but they're not. Tolerance is a bearing, it's a struggle. It's confronting something that makes you uncomfortable, something that perhaps is abhorrent or repulsive. But the reason why tolerance is so important is that tolerance allows diversity to be possible. So as we think through some of these issues in the conference, I think it's important to keep these ideas in mind: who we exclude, when we exclude them, why we exclude them, and at what point, if we do start excluding people from our various communities, are we really jeopardizing that value of diversity that seems so important to many of us?
Michael.
Okay. We have limited time, so I'm going to be very quick, and I'm going to be very broad in order to be provocative and contrast, I think, a lot with what Jacob said. So the class of society that my family life and my education prepared me for, and the one that I think Wake Forest hopes to prepare many of its students for, is, when you get into it, deeply schizophrenic place. It is a place where the public orthodoxy, the public goal you're supposed to chase, is egalitarianism, is the equality of human beings. All policies have to conduce to this equality or flow from it in some way. And yet even the slightest observation of this class of human beings that graduate from universities shows that they work fanatically and tirelessly for their own personal advancement in their own material, social, and honorific advantage over others. And I think that this schizophrenia of self-seeking humanitarians that we have is the predictable result of a culture of letters in our country that has abandoned the trials of living in community for the advantages of living in a rival to communities, which are networks. The network model of human relations is at best a convenience for innovation, critique, and personal advancement for those that benefit from them. And I don't deny that network models produce human goods. What I deny is that the network model of human relations can entirely replace or supplant the life of community and still produce good humans. Network model can't be eliminated and should not be eliminated from human life. I am not a totalistic communitarian, but I believe that the threat is the opposite of the one Jacob defines. I think the threat is now that America's elite is so biased towards network thinking that it is threatening their own ability and everyone's ability to recover the goods of community life. Many people who come to college feel that they've escaped from an oppressive community, right? And I think that's a common thing to think at that age. the network model of human relations naturally appeals to college students because you have advantages. And networks do advantage people that are gifted with intellect, skill, talent, riches, power of some sort. The talented and ambitious, the people who aspire to this class of selfish egalitarians, they often resent community life because it is in community life that you are asked to mortify your passions and ambitions, to make sacrifices for the weak or for posterity who cannot possibly repay you in favors. And the network way of living, in a way, is a way of disguised favor trading. You do favors for people in the network, and while you maybe not expect a direct payoff from that person, you expect that the network itself will reward you in the long run. You know, but networks are also, in a sense, they're false communities. They provide this illusion of a first-person plural, a we, but it's more like the we of a conspiracy. When a conspirator is caught or becomes a liability, his fellow conspirators deny having known them at all. A caught conspirator cannot depend on the loyalty of his crew. In fact, you were all using each other. You were a collection of eyes working together. But of course, as you lose your money, your talent, your skill, your ambition, your youth, you are ejected from networked ways of living in life. And the only thing you can do is depend upon communities, people that are bound to you in certain ways. And if we do not find a way for the rich and talented and strong to be reintegrated into communities, they'll continue this pattern of secession from common life of their communities and their nations for their own plunder and advancement. I worry that they will plunge the rest of us into a permanent system of networks in which we know we owe each other nothing and we have no expectation of return, in which the market defines our value entirely, and in which transactionalism fatally poisons human friendship and it makes civil peace impossible. And I just want to add as a kind of coda and a final provocation. We talk about how we want, in network life, about how we want things to be diverse and inclusive. And I think we've talked about how, in a way, this is totally fraudulent rhetoric. We say we value diversity, but of course, human diversity is the product of exclusive communities, communities that exclude, languages, religions, customs, and cultures that are built on exclusion and obedience to a common way of life. In fact, exclusive communities are the only thing that can bear and preserve diversity in our world. And I think what we are trying to express when we talk about how we want diversity and inclusion is a kind of an American enamorment with what is really the first feeling of homogenization. We don't want a closed and settled society in some ways. We want newcomers to be able to come in and challenge us and prod us. But ultimately, whether they are Dutch Calvinists who hold to the 5 points of Calvinism, whether they're Lutherans who speak German, or they're Bosnian Muslims, or any other group that enters into America, we basically ask them in the long run that their dogmas and that their customs eventually come to conform to the general irreligiosity and cultural interchangeability of America's founding Protestant stock. So my question is, can we save community from the network, from the logic and predation of network thinking? And can America bear the existence of durable communities that use the normal means to preserve themselves? That is, marshaling their honorific sources according to their own definitions. That means discrimination, exclusivity, and preserving their faith and culture from the process of homogenization.
I just want to pause for a moment.
Yes.
There were, I couldn't even take notes swiftly enough. So first of all, thank you to the entire panel for taking these questions so seriously. I will begin by simply asking a few of you to engage in some claymation battle with one another, and then we will open it up to both the audience and the live stream for questions. I also actually want to draw back a little bit from a few questions that were posed at the dinner last night as a way of engaging some of the questions and frameworks that were leveled here on this panel. Last night, one of our students, so let me just explain that we had an opening dinner mostly for the panelists who will be presenting across the next 2 days. At dinner last night, Professor Tom Cushman and our own Provost Rogan Kersh, who is here with us in the auditorium, who called this entire conference into being through his call to Rethink Community, engaged with Jim Otteson from the Eudaimonia Institute as the moderator in a really intense conversation about the question of the future of American liberal arts education. The conversation ended with one of our undergraduate students posing a question that Jim ended us on, which is college home? I want to start there in part because both Jacob and, in certain ways, Congresswoman Edwards, actually, I'm just going to start calling you Senator Edwards because I'm just going to speak that into being. Maybe Governor Edwards. Yeah. Trustee Edwards. I'm interested in, Jacob, the ways in which you were particularly asking us to think about universities, Jacob, as a space that would have frameworks for inquiry, potentially holding a framework for inquiry as a value of community. As a trustee of this university, Congresswoman Edwards, you both reflected on your experiences here in which there was a narrowing of your experience of community relative to your experiences having grown up in a military family, but then also thought a little bit for us about the ways in which you have sometimes allowed the experiences of looking outward and inward. As you were talking, I kept thinking about David asking us that question, is college home? You know, my sense was, hell no, I ain't your mama. Provost Kersh ain't your daddy. Get your feet off the table. You ain't not at home. But I wanted to say, but certainly it's your community. Then I'm thinking, listening to Jacob, but no, maybe it's just your framework for inquiry. Then I listen to Michael and I think, oh, hell, maybe it is your home. Maybe if we're not home for David, who is? It can't be just your network, son. Lord, I'm with Michael half an hour and I got Catholic guilt. Help me think about that question in the context of what you've given us here. How might we think, I promise we're going to get to many other things, but just on this question, how might we think about a response to David? Is college home?
So, wow. I mean, I think that within the university, just like in life and work life, you do end up building a smaller community because you want it to feel like home, because it gives you a comfort zone so you can build around you people who are, supportive and validating for you in the kind of way that home would be. I don't think it's really home, but it serves that purpose for the 4 years that you're in the institution. And for some of us, it serves a purpose beyond that, depending on how we continue those relationships. It was interesting in listening because I really deeply wanted to associate my feelings about communities and networks from the polar opposite end, which I never thought that I would do. Because the experience of being then in a in a Congress which really was a network where people just did things just so they can build on others in order to advance themselves. And so you don't go around saying, oh, that's my community. Those are people I can rely on. That can be home base for me. And I do think that within a university institution that it's tough to survive if you don't build a home base. I know that there are people who kind of do that on their own and do that for 4 years as undergraduates. But for me, that would not have been a healthy thing to do. And so I think we're always looking in whatever space we travel to figure out what our home base is and to and selectively, bring in people so that we can validate each other. And I think that's very different from a network. I think it's a way, particularly in a university setting, for students to understand the place they are, to try out their ideas in a safe way, to begin to understand how you take in criticism and critique. And you can do that when you build a safe space, and I think that's part of what happens in a university. How that translates when you leave the university setting, I'm not sure, because there's so much more of our society that really is, forget the inquiry, they're just looking to build networks, and you have to learn those tools, or that becomes a mechanism through which you won't survive either.
It's funny, when you started the question about is college home, I didn't hear it as being about the students. I heard it as being about us. Because we're the ones
Live here forever.
who live here without us. No, but it's the case that
Right.
we live here forever. Here might be different universities over the course of a career, but I genuinely do believe in the faculty having a long-term relationship with the institution in a way that creeps it a little bit closer to being home-like, though it still makes me nervous.
Dorian ran away from home.
Universities, I've described them elsewhere as nested associations that have things that are very much like safe space communities at the smallest level of the nesting. And that's true in faculty life as well as student life. It's true of inquiry as well as of just living. In here, in this room, whether this room is our shared membership in a religious club that we students have together, or our shared classroom that is doing this work, the study of biology, not that work, the study of philosophy, or a department or a center which is organized around one mode of inquiry, not other modes of inquiry. In all those spaces, there is considerable insulation against the person who comes in wanting to talk about their thing. You can say, we're busy here, we're doing work. We are trying to sort out our religious faith. We are trying to make progress on this question. We are trying to advance this research agenda. No, it is not actually that interesting to have the economists show up for the 80th time in a political theory talk and say, aha, you're just doing normative stuff, and normative stuff is nothing but subjective preference. No, it's not. But more importantly, we'll have that conversation somewhere else. Right now, you're being boring and disruptive. And that's true for the white undergraduate who shows up in the black student and says, well, don't you think that really everyone should get into college on their own individual merit? Well, it's a lot more complicated than that, and there's a whole lot that you're not taking into account. But more importantly, we'll talk about that somewhere else. We're doing work here. There are safe spaces in universities, and I think that comes close to the idea of there being communities, plural, in universities. Places where you say, we share this project, and we have these things in common. But as you go higher up the organizational framework, the safety thins out, if it's going to be the case that we are able to say, no, I'll argue with you about that somewhere else. The somewhere else has to exist. There has to be a moment of debate, of interdisciplinarity, which doesn't mean we all just get along, but it means we talk about the ways in which we interdisciplinarily don't. There have to be spaces of genuine political disagreement, spaces where religious commitments can come under question, and so on and so on. The temptation to communityize the university that I talked about in my remarks, I think that's a little bit like the temptation to export the feeling of home to the whole organization. I've also written about, in defense of students who wanted to feel like their dorm, their residential college was home-like, and the desire to have something like a safe space in their residential college. But the defense of the safety of that space, of the home-likeness of when I come home at night, I want to be able to turn off a certain level of combat. That's justified partly because it's situated in a framework that isn't like that overall. And so for all that my initial instinct was say, well, yeah, for me, a university is meaningfully my home. I want to correct myself and check myself from saying that, because really feeling like that would mean that I felt like I could relate to my colleagues and relate to my students in a different, more homogenizing way than I think is rightful or respectful in the kind of institution that a university is.
Just ask, does that kind of compartmentalization, though, allow you to just say, the other stuff that's going on at the university, not my thing?
No. I think that when I call something an organization or an institution or a framework, I am saying something thicker than what Michael's talking about by way of networks. In networks, we really do have just that, well, if this isn't a reciprocal moment, if there's nothing in it for me, it's not my problem. I do think that the care and protection, the maintenance and the preservation of the institution, that is my problem. But it's my problem in a morally and emotionally and psychologically different way from the I'm actually monitoring and keeping in line the people in my home, the people in my community. I have to engage with the other people in my institution in a different, slightly more arm's length way. But I still need to engage. I really do. It's not my problem.
Dorian, you wanted in?
Yeah, so I'm troubled by this notion of home because some people's homes are traumatic, which is why I ran away from the university, frankly. And so I think we have to explore what we mean by home, because I think it's an imagined home. And there's a lot underneath there. Is it safety? Is it security? Is it a place for nurturing? Is it a place for growth?
It's an expensive home.
And I think there's an element of home and community. I think we should add a concept of temporality. So are we backward looking or future looking? Are we thinking nostalgically about some past community, as we often do in public debates? Are we thinking nostalgically backwards about some imagined what it was like at home, and we're trying to recreate that? Or are we future oriented and trying to construct something new? Maybe I never had that at home, so I come to the university to construct a place of safety or nurturing or growth. So I just want to problematize what's underneath home, because not everyone, right, has an image of it as this safe place that is somehow desirable and that we want to get to.
So Dorian, you talked about movement and the extent to which, and it's important to me to connect this to what you're talking about here around problematizing the very idea of home or of community. You talked about movement, and Chris, in your conversation of bringing in the idea of criminal justice reform and criminal justice and golf. and honestly, so in full honesty, knowing, we're New Orleanians, and you say, okay, we're talking about community and exclusion and inclusion, and you and I both having roots in New Orleans, and you say golf club, and my whole soul just passed out. I just went, no! Let's not do golf clubs and exclusion.
You've never been to Bartholomew up by the lake.
Yeah, no. I, at the very end of my time in New Orleans, lived on, God help me, Calhoun. You know, oh, the things that happen in the South. And so we know the history of the golf club up there, uptown, on Calhoun. And it was interesting, even as I heard you talk about movement through, and you said, well, you know, if you don't get into Wake Forest, you can probably go on and your life will be fine. And I was like, unless you were legally kept from going because you were Black. And some might argue that the exclusion associated with the price of higher education across the country, not just at Wake, but across the country as tuitions rise, has that kind of exclusionary effect. So let me ask this about communities and movements, because a lot of what we've talked about here does feel like we are talking about opting in and opting out and making choices. And yet so much of what happens about what communities we end up in tends to not be about choice, tends to be about structures, tends to be about choices others make for us, about the ways that others identify us, about how public policies choose where we live, how we associate, who associates us, who polices us, who allows us in the door, who allows us opportunities. So I would love, both for Chris and for Dorian, to talk a little bit about how our communities are chosen for us and not just how we choose our communities.
Go for it. I got to think about how I'm defending the golf club.
Oh, no, I know. No. You didn't say it, my soul did it, because as a Southerner, when you say golf club and choice, I just go,
Yeah, and look,
but you actually weren't saying that, but I'm like, that's like the associative thing that happens for me, right?
yeah, and it's really interesting because there are a lot of communities or a lot of organizations that when you mention them, immediately you think of certain characteristics
Exactly.
about that organization or even people who are members of that organization, right? So you can make certain assumptions, or you've probably made certain assumptions about me, white guy from New Orleans who plays golf, who's wearing a suit with no
Yes.
tie and pink socks.
There you
right?
go.
You're making
Do it, Chris.
certain
Yes.
judgments
Go, Chris.
about me,
Yes.
right? But
Yes.
this is now a community or group that I've now become a part of, that you've placed me in, that I haven't chosen, or maybe I did choose, along those lines. And this is where we do have to look at certain types of power dynamics, either in this country or when you're looking at certain communities. Because it's one thing for me being the white guy from New Orleans to say, ha ha, we can laugh at that. But if I'm a, say, Black student at the University of New Orleans who, walks into the room, right, you may make other judgments about that student based on what he looks like, what he wears, what his background is. And I think that's really the challenge. Because it's one thing when those communities or groups that you don't choose are positive, right, in a certain sense, or we can chuckle about them. It's another thing when decisions that you haven't made about your life, right, things that were chosen for you by someone else, affect your life in a negative way or affect your life in a way that you don't want. And then the question becomes, well, how do we address those? And that's a very difficult question, and I have really no good answer for that question. Beyond that, it's important to recognize them, right? It's important for us to recognize in a group like this that we can chuckle about me playing golf, or certain judgments that you make about me, or certain things that we make about whomever. But we're also sitting up on a panel at a really prestigious university. Where we can sort of laugh about things like that. So the best I think we can do is to recognize it. And then once you recognize it, when you're in a position where you can actually make a positive difference, then you should probably do what you can to allow for those changes to take place.
Thank you, Chris. Dorian, you want to jump on that?
I'll jump in on that based on something Chris just said, because I think the word you, that comes to, well, Chris said the word explicitly, Melissa, that your question points to, and that's power.
Yes.
Power operates in and through communities. Communities aren't separate from relations of power. And so when you say structures and choices made by others that construct your community, those are reflections of power relations. And I think that then raises, I think, some of the core questions of this conversation. Well, then who wields power, or who gets to decide? Those, right, who has a choice and who doesn't? Is it a community that's about domination or non-domination? And often communities are contradictory because they can be sometimes both oppressive and empowering at the same time. So if I think of Black communities, racial segregation by law and practice, and those within them, right, didn't necessarily choose to be racially, physically, socially segregated. And so those are unjust power relations, creating a community. Those in it aren't there by choice, yet at the same time, they're also places of empowerment and of nurturing and of home. So how do we grapple with that contradiction of particular communities where there are unjust, undemocratic relations of power acting on certain communities or shaping or constructing certain communities that also create the conditions for liberation and freedom and autonomy? And so I just raise that as a contradiction because I don't know how to think about it, but it is. And none of us really, it's rare when we get to start a community from scratch. Maybe that is a network. But most of us are either born into or end up in communities that have existed before us. So then the question becomes, well, how do we, if that's true, for many of our communities that aren't started from scratch, how do we think about rethinking and reorganizing and reconstructing, redesigning those communities in more democratic and freedom-promoting ways?
It's why I wince about the sitting together in the pit. I remember coming and sitting in the pit, and I liked it. I was like, hell yeah, I'm in the pit with the Black kids. And it didn't feel narrower, it felt bigger. Right? Because it was like, because we was in the pit together. Yeah. In the pit together, right? But I also get that, like, if you exclusively sit in the pit together and never anywhere, like, then also you miss the rest of Wake. So I don't want to miss the rest of Wake, but I also want to sit in the pit together. And damn, you tell me I can't sit in the pit together, because I'm sit in the pit together. But then, I also want to do some other, I also want to wake the vote together. But then, I don't wake the vote all the time. I also want to sit in the pit together.
Yeah, but I worry about that kind of framework because, then I go to Congress and you have the Congressional Black Caucus and the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, and then we sit together too on the House floor as representatives. And so, continuing to find that community, but then to actually reinforce a more oppressive structure is what I worry about. And it's not just about us, it's about a majority population that kind of needs to know us a little bit so that it doesn't continue to reinforce those models. And you don't get that if you're just like hanging out in the pit together.
Michael, shorter. Hashtag community is, or we will disintegrate. Jacob, shorter. Hashtag is community? Nah. Y'all want to fight that out?
Well, listen, I actually agreed with a lot of what Jacob said about the university itself, that there are demands that you would make of your home or your community that are inappropriate for the university. I still think of universities as a kind of intentional community that fosters a classically liberal ethos of the exchange of ideas. And I think on that point, the community of the university has to act like a community, which is to police that and say, we are going to have free exchanges. We are going to do this. In a way, I think you are, in a sense, acting like a communitarian on behalf of a liberal space, a liberal community. when you defend it that way. I just think that as, you know, speaking from my own experiences mostly as I've come up from a middle class home in Halcyon Park in Bloomfield, New Jersey, that was entirely Italian and Irish and had this descended and had this ethos. My sense as I've grown up and moved into colleges and into a more networked life is of loss of community. That there are no spaces where there are few spaces except for my own family where I can act in a self-sacrificing way that is ultimately what is rewarding, when you're on your deathbed. It won't be just what favors you traded in network systems or even some of the institutions you provided, but who you were and who you were in communities that weren't necessarily chosen for you. In communities that, we often say a community is unchosen, and in some ways that's no different than saying in some cases that yes, your obstacles in life were unchosen, the people calling you out were unchosen, but also your gifts were unchosen. The things your community gave you that you could not have given yourself were also unchosen. And I think maturing is not just straining at your community, but also finally giving in and being thankful for it and returning something to it.
So I certainly agree that we need community in our lives, and I tried to start my remarks with that and to keep returning to it. And there are tensions between the preservation, the maintenance, the work of community life and both more abstract institutions and then what Michael was talking about as networks. None of that, by the way, is new. And it's not nearly as new as the kind of communitarian impulse to worry about, liberal kids these days would lead us to think. Cities and universities have always been like that. For the 1,000 years of European history since universities took their form in cities as they were taking their form, people left where they were from. And they went off to the city and the university. Those were, incidentally, partly defined as networks. You would walk around Europe in your authentic habitat, your scholarly habits, your robes, your cap and gown. What that meant was that you were allowed to travel freely unmolested from one university to another. The local idiot warlord wasn't allowed to draft you or tax you or throw you in prison. You had the special protection of the network. That allowed for the growth of something really wonderful in the mercantile life of the network of European cities and the intellectual network of the eventually worldwide system of universities. And yet people were still living their over a long lifespan, psychologically rich and complicated lives. That means sometimes they return to roots. And some of them do. Many of them do. There's still then always the moment of cultural panic about the ones who don't. There are people who go off and get their university degrees and they never go home. They migrate around the whole world as rootless cosmopolitans. That worry is literally 1,000 years old. And we keep managing to muddle our way through in worlds that have communities and abstract institutions and networks. So I don't want to give much ground to the very contemporary sounding version of this as a panic that says, aha, the elites of our modern rootless cosmopolitans who go off to their East Coast universities and live high-flying finance lives and are frequent flyers, that's a basic organizing feature of the complexity of our social lives. It's not actually anything deeply new. And over the course of one life, the pendulum swings, and over the course of a complex society, pendulums swing. Some people go back and some people don't. And the ones who don't, they build new things where they are. The other part of my emphasis on the institutions as separate from the network. In network theory, I'm talking about the nodes. The cities and the universities are places where people live. And they don't interact with them just in this transactional, reciprocal way. There are a few people who do. They get a bad reputation. In a university, the person who feels like their feet have only touched the ground long enough to get a raise at their next job, we have names that we call those people, and it's important to us that we not populate our whole university with people like that. Because we need people who are willing to do the institutional work and to stick around. I think that we have ways of rebuilding and rerouting at the nodes of the network, even in light of the ongoing movement that the network facilitates.
I'm going to open it to Q&A before I get in any more trouble. Yes, sir. When you ask your question, project out and tell us your name as well. Stand up, Deeks, go Deeks.
So I come here like all of us with my own biases. I grew up in the wealthiest district in my state. I didn't ever had to fear the police growing up. I knew that college at a place like Wake Forest was all but a guarantee. I proudly subscribe to the New Yorker and read the New York Times every day. You can like seeing Professor from New Orleans in a suit and pink socks. You can fill in your own observations. And like Dr. Levy said, I'm headed to a major financial services firm in New York after I graduate. My question is this: past generations are far from perfect, but it doesn't seem like we can really be bothered to get out of class or out of bed to come to this. We talk about how, like on Twitter, we have these 140-character statements of virtue signaling, but yet when it comes time to actually talk these issues through, there are 10 of us. So my question is, how do we move past this? Is this unique to our generation? The institutional support is here, loud and clear. We have 2 institutes on campus, but I'm ready to see something better happen. So if anyone wanted to address, what do we do now?
Better, not better, just more populated.
Yeah.
You're too young to be kids these days, Abe.
Yeah.
That's our job.
It's heartening.
Although, I mean, I don't know that it's any different than it has been. And I don't know that what you described is any different from a whole lot of other institutions all across the country. And it still doesn't mean that there weren't young people who come to university, they get what they get, they go out into the world, and you know, they learn and build on that. And so I don't want you to be too hard on yourself and your peers. Did you guys ever sleep through anything in college?
It's 9 o'clock.
9
This
a.m.
is early for us.
Yeah.
No, I mean, look, I think you've got to. From what I can tell, there's a lot of really good student engagement going on this campus. In the little that I know about Wake Forest, I remember being in college. I was the president of one of the undergraduate. We only had undergraduate. One of the political organizations. And this was during the election. Rudy Giuliani was holding some sort of rally somewhere, and we sent 0 of our college Republicans to the Rudy Giuliani rally. And someone from the New York Times called me and asked, why did no one show up? And I said, it was 9 a.m. on a Saturday. What do you think college kids are doing? Do we rather sleep or go listen to Rudy Giuliani? I mean, I think there's certain expectations that I think need to be tempered, but there's a lot of interest, as best as I can tell. Students are excited. You know, one of the things that I've done in just the 24 hours I've been here is to talk with a number of students. Not just the ones that have sort of been handled and brought to me, but others, right? About what are the views on this? That's how it is, right? You know, what are the views of students on campus when it comes to free speech, when it comes to these institutes? And students have been very positive. But as you know, there are a lot of things going on. So don't get discouraged. I think it's actually a great sign that we have that many students here, given that there are all the various competing things. Never mind all the students who were at dinner last night and all the students who are otherwise engaged on this campus.
And Dorian, you're an organizer.
So I was just
Can you-
gonna, yeah, so the one word that hasn't come up about community, actually surprisingly, is it takes work. It takes work to build community. We can either bribe people or organize them.
Swag.
So swag, I was thinking more like food, right, and swag. But that only goes so far. There's no question in my mind that there aren't at least 200 more students on this campus interested in this topic. But it's an organizing question of how you get them here, and that actually takes work, right? So putting on my organizer's hat, I would say, okay, so who are the 10 people on your list who you committed to make sure was here? Right? Did you call them last night? Did you email them? Did you tweet them? Did you snap them? Like whatever it takes, right? I mean, I'm not picking on you. I'm just saying, like, thinking like an organizer, it actually takes a work and effort, or just passion and enthusiasm. Like, hey, I'm going to this thing tomorrow, Chris. Do you want to go with me?
Yeah.
All right? Okay,
know what the thing
so
is,
then
but
I'm
I'm
gonna meet you at 8:30,
Right.
right, at the front door of the building, or I'm gonna come to your room and grab you, because I know you're still gonna hit snooze on the alarm, right? So anyway, all that to say, like this, and it's part of a bigger theme here of it, building community takes work, and constructing communities takes work. It takes work to build a network too, I might add. But all this stuff, right, and especially if you wanna build a community to change existing power relations or to transform something, that takes even more work. You can't ever assume people will just show up. People show up on Twitter because it's easy and it's fun, and sometimes it's substantive and most of the time it's not, right? But for the things that have meat and grit, I mean, you show up to class during exam period because you have to. That's a norm and a rule that's policed, and you suffer if you don't show up. But almost everything else just takes work to actually show up and show up with lots of other folks to construct a community.
Yeah, I'm sitting here in the room looking, and I see Chizoba, Fahim, Cassandra, Marianne Majuga, I see Brad, I see Sherry, who don't even work here no more officially. I see Danny, who is still on maternity leave. So this is like the team. Oh, I see Danny's husband, which means I'm really worried about where the baby is. I'm actually deeply concerned. I see, and so, let's see. So these folks are folks who I call student affairs professionals. They also call themselves student affairs professionals. SAP, SAPs. So work, also SAPs. So that's what SAPs do, right? So SAPs, they make the calls, they call the babies, they make it home, right? So also my mother Diana Gray, who is a retired SAP, but still totally a SAP, and was a SAP at the University of Chicago for a decade. And so SAPs help to organize the students. So what I will say, Jack, is over at PHI, anytime you need a SAP to help you like get some students out, and EI are our people now. So like, if you are like, where are the students? There, the SAPs will help you. And so ODI's whole team, woo, sapping. So the SAPs are happy to help you to learn the work of organizing your fellow students, because it is work. Yeah, absolutely. Other questions? Yeah, Encore.
My name is Makapara Kante. I'm a former student who graduated in May. And if we're talking about who's in the room and who's not, I'm wondering what the panel makes of the presence of Winston-Salem community members at the conference right now. There aren't any Winston-Salem community members on this panel. As part of the opening plenary, and colleges are, of course, situated in, as Dorian alluded to earlier, geographical community or geographic communities. And so, yeah, what does that mean that we're...
All day Saturday.
Huh?
All day Saturday.
Oh, right. But I mean, this is right? It's all day Saturday, but this is like
Yes.
opening, it's like setting a framework.
It is.
So what does that mean? And I'm not sure if you are, if how many residents of Winston-Salem are in the room, but also like how diverse are those residents that are here? Because it seems like there might just at least like that don't live here because they like work on this campus. So yeah, what do you make of that?
I'm going to assume most people are at work.
Right, it's Friday, at work.
It's why it's all day Saturday.
I mean,
That was why we had done that.
yeah, but great question.
It is,
Well, I will.
An important question.
I mean, I will say, when I was here at Wake Forest, I thought of the university as largely just sitting here in this town, very close to the community, really very insular. And in the couple of decades since I left the university, I think it's actually done a better job of planting itself in the community. And I mean, the Wake downtown, I think, has been an important addition. The institutes drawing in the community. And it's not perfect, but I do remember a time when this university was here and people in Winston-Salem couldn't even tell you how to, it just wasn't part of the community. And I do think that that has changed. I think it's a problem for a lot of institutions. You know, I'm in the Washington, D.C. area, and many of our institutions, even though they're planted right in the city, are not really part of the city in a way, and people who are in the community don't necessarily go into those zones and associate with the universities. And I think increasingly, I mean, universities have to figure out a way that they are part of the communities in which they sit, that they you know, sort of relate to communities by drawing in, you know, young people in the high schools and reaching out into the city sort of elected leadership to figure out how it is that the university can be a partner in the city that it calls home. And I think that there are very few universities who've done a good job of that.
and I will say that that is I mean, that's a fair and important question, and it is the number one question we are taking up all day on Saturday. So I will just say that the way the conference is structured, just as a kind of overview, is that today are kind of like the big kind of national questions that are about campuses for the most part. Tomorrow is all about the campus community, town gown, God help us, relationship, I mean, as a framework to say town versus gown. But, and it's a fair critique and important point, but we did structure it that way in part because Saturday is a day when we wanted to make, be sure that we had more accessibility. So we do move off the Renolda campus and down to the downtown campus so that we are more centrally located in community tomorrow. And so we will be down at the Biotech Center and Wake downtown tomorrow. And we have the Winston-Salem Ideas Exchange. So in your swag bags, you will see all of tomorrow's activities. The afternoon sessions are completely led by voices from our Winston-Salem community, telling us, sourcing ideas up from Winston-Salem voices and community members. But we did make that plan purposely so that folks would have maximum participation opportunities with the recognition that many folks work what we might think of as 9 to 5 or 5 to 9 in today's workplace jobs on Friday. And so just as a way of sort of thinking about what it means to try to think through what a conference is.
Could I just add to that? Because I think, Mankiver, it's a really important question. I was thinking through, all right, I've been affiliated with 5 universities in my life. All of them have town gown issues, every single one. And so I'm going to generalize from my sample. Why is that? And what does that mean about how universities construct themselves in terms of who's included and who's excluded? And it also ignores the fact that actually the surrounding community in most universities are included in a particular way, and it's as a labor force to the university for the exclusive community of students who almost never see the workers on campus as part of their community. And especially low-wage service workers who, when I was on some campuses, tried to create some bonds of solidarity and community with my fellow students, and it was always the hardest organizing challenge. To get my fellow students to see that the person in the dining hall was also, or should be also, part of the community of the university, and it just never happened. I get more folks out to a party any day of the week that I could get them to like go to a meeting to care about the workers on the campus. So every place I've been, this is an issue, so I'm glad you raised the question because I think it's endemic the universities, and public and private, by the way. So that's not a, a limiting thing. And it goes back to the question raised earlier about, well, what is then the purpose of a university? And how do we construct that community? And what does it mean to add the employment relationship into this conversation of universities as employers, not just like nice, nurturing homes away from homes?
Which also, by the way, is the topic of our keynote address at lunch from the person who is perhaps the expert on that topic. Professor Steve Diner will address exactly that issue of what is the responsibility and role of the university relative to community. So you'll get a little preview of the Saturday conversation just after lunch at 1 o'clock. I think we are going to, at this point, we are going to finally play our video from Secretary John King, and then we're going to move into our break. I want to say one last thing on moderator's privilege here, which is just, I heard a few folks say that part of what happens in community is that we look for, while we're, if you want to do the tech, I'll just say this as we're, because there's like a push the button thing, right? One of the things that happens is that we're looking for opportunities to see ourselves in community. So I'm going to say this whenever my provost is in the room, because he said, think about things that are outcomes. So I'm just going to always, whenever my provost is in the room, I'm going to say, here's an idea. Last night I said, make college 5 years so people have more time to think thoughts. So here's another one. Rogan's like, I'm not coming to any more sessions, so here we go. All right, so people want to see themselves in their community. You know that you can't change the deacon. So the deacon, we love the deacon. Like the demon deacon, the deacon is the greatest, but the deacon's a little white dude. And you can't change it. Like you cannot change the deacon. You can't. This is the rule. They won't make it. They won't print it any other way. But I want to be able to make the deacon with a little afro puff. And I want to make the deacon with the hijab. And I want to make the deacon other ways. So here's my deal. I think the deacon should be able to be black and brown and queer and a girl and all the cool things that the deacon is, because the deacon is all of that. He's not just a white guy. So I think we should be able to moderate the deacon. There we go. Community is queer brown deacons. Great. All righty. Now we're going to play the video from Secretary King, and then I'm turning over the mic to Zerlina before I get in any more trouble. We're still in the plenary.
I just want to put makeup on. Give him a little foundation. When I was here, there were 48 6 black women in my class.
For all the work that she's doing to advocate for unity at this moment. With so much division in our country right now, it's inspiring that you've all gathered with the hope of finding. Hi, I'm John King. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Rethinking Community Forum. Sorry I couldn't be there with you today, but sending best wishes for healthy dialogue about current events. I also want to say thank you to Melissa Harris Perry for all the work that she's doing to advocate for unity at this moment. With so much division in our country right now, it's inspiring that you've all gathered with the hope of finding some common ground and pushing for a way forward. I believe that our democracy, our communities, and our nation are stronger because of our diversity. But we also must stand up and fight in those moments that require us to protect our children's future. Students this year are in schools and on college campuses across America during a time when this country may not seem to be living up to its ideals. Children are watching while Nazis and KKK march in the streets. Immigrants are told to go home in the only country they've ever known. They've heard rhetoric that targets people because of their religion, their race, and their family's country of origin. And they wonder if they're safe. They've watched countless incidents where police have killed unarmed victims without any consequences. They've seen senseless mass shootings, and they hope it never happens to them or their families or their friends or classmates. American dream is under attack in this country, and we need action on behalf of more young people to preserve it, especially our young people of color and our low-income families. We've got much work to do as a nation, but I do believe our best days are ahead of us. The strength of our democracy depends on all of us as Americans, understanding our history and the ties that bind us. It depends on us becoming informed and thoughtful about local, state, and national issues. It depends on us getting involved in solving problems in our schools, communities, states, and across the nation. It depends on us recognizing that the solutions to complex issues we face today all require compromise. It depends on us being willing to think beyond ourselves to embrace our obligations to the greater good. As you attend this conference, I hope you'll keep that in mind. Best wishes for a great next few days.
How about a round of applause for our opening panel? That was